Hello, how are you guys all doing this morning, this afternoon, evening, whenever you are watching this? This past Sunday, I gave you all a homework assignment, and that was to use these hermeneutical principles, these rules of interpretation we talked about on Sunday, to go through a difficult passage regarding this topic that we're discussing in our sermon series called What About the Women? The passage is 1 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 16, and I thought I've given you the whole week to look at it. Maybe you're curious to hear kind of where my thoughts land, and then we can use this to continue our discussion as we go through further in our series, What About the Women? So here's my thoughts. I'm going to read through the passage and then just kind of share with you where do I land with it and how do I go through those hermeneutical principles as like a review of your homework assignment if you get this far. For one, this one's about head coverings and worship. And for the most part, most churches have kind of set this aside. I know there's several churches and traditions that would say women do need to have their head covered, or as we'll see, long hair. But we don't practice that. Why? Is that okay? And what is Paul trying to say if it's not telling us to wear head coverings or long hair? So those are the questions we're going to answer. I want to read this real quick. Feel free to pull it out, get the Bible, and read along with me. You'll probably want to, especially if you're doing the homework. But if not, you can just listen and kind of hear what would the first century church, what would that church in Corinth hear if they were reading this letter or this letter was being read to them from Paul. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off, or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So, there's quite a bit there. And if you're listening to it with the ears of a 21st century Christian, as we are, questions arise all over the place. There's a ton of things that maybe we don't understand or don't sound familiar to us from what we've been taught according to the Bible. So I said the first thing we try to do when we're reading a passage is understand that original meaning. There's two different ways of going about that. One is trying to understand the historical context so that we can hear what that first century church heard. And then the other would be looking at the literary context, trying to understand the flow of thought for the author. What is the point that they're trying to make? I just want to maybe start off with that historical context, literary context. The main point of what this passage is saying, I think is clear. Paul wants women to cover their head when they're praying and prophesying, right? So they're gathering here at church, probably in someone's house, and when the women are participating, they need to have a head covering. That's probably what we can all agree on. Anything beyond that, though, there's a ton of questions. The first thing is, we don't know what the head coverings are. I think of like a veil of some sort. I think in Middle Eastern cultures, especially with Islam, and they have women that cover their heads or their hair or their entire bodies, their faces. That's what comes to my mind, but is that what Paul has in mind here? Maybe. Clearly they knew what he was talking about. There's a hint even at the end talking about that long hair is given to her as a covering at the end of verse 15. So perhaps Paul is talking about long hair this whole time. It's not talking about covering the head or the hair with a veil, but rather it's long hair. We don't know. It could be either way. Another one of the questions is, what is the circumstance that caused Paul to write this? This is addressing a problem. So the whole section here in 1 Corinthians is talking about very specific issues that he's heard about in the church in Corinth, and he's addressing. Like, it just comes back from whether or not you should eat meat that's sacrificed to idols or not. It's like, yes, no, what is it, Paul? Right after that, he's going to talk to them about how they're not practicing the Lord's Supper correctly. And right in the middle of this section is about this head coverings. It's very specific to how they are gathering as a church and where he sees they need correction. And so there's some issue. Some people want women to wear head coverings, other people don't. Now, we don't know how it's split. We don't know if the women are the ones that want to wear a head covering or if the women are the ones that don't want to wear a head covering. We don't even know if it's mixed gender, and there's just some people that say women should wear head coverings, and some are saying women shouldn't wear head coverings. There's even like historical context. You can look at research that would argue kind of either ways, that perhaps women want to be more free and liberated and not wear a veil. That would be a very closer Western 21st century outlook that we kind of are familiar with. But if you look at more of an Eastern cultures or even early centuries, women might have wanted to wear a veil just for protection or for an equality of status where they were at. The fact of the matter is we don't know any of those circumstances around the context, and that does make it more difficult to understand, well, what is Paul saying? But I think we can be clear. Paul is saying women should wear a head covering, whether that's long hair or whether that's a veil. Now, the other thing I said about our hermeneutical principles is what's the other scriptural support? Excuse me. So the things that we see here are these the things that Paul's teaching, are those supported by other scripture? For example, one of the hardest parts of this passage is there in verse 7 and 8, and 9 as well. It says, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It sounds like Paul is saying that man is the image of God, but not woman. And then he's establishing some sort of like a hierarchy, right? Where man doesn't come from woman, but woman comes from man. And man wasn't created for woman, but woman for man. We have to ask ourselves, what scriptural support do we have for man being elevated above woman, and man perhaps having the image of God and woman just the image of man? And that, when we look in the Bible, is not taught anywhere else. It's very clear in Genesis chapter 1, 27 and 28, that it's both male and female are created in the image of God. It's both of them together. It's not man is created in the image of God and then female some sort of image of the image, like a photocopy or something like that. That's not taught. And there's other passages that talk of our redemption into this new glorified body, being created into the image of Christ. And it's both male and female. There's no difference between male and female concerning our relationship to God being the image of God and our destinies being aligned with conforming to the image of Christ moving forward. So we can't say that Paul is trying to elevate men and say they're the only ones that have the image of God. What we see here is Paul's main point is to convince the church women should wear a head covering. When he alludes back to the creation accounts, when he talks here about man did not come from woman, or there in verse 3 about the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, the head of Christ is God, that's a supplemental argument for his main argument of women wearing head coverings. You see that? Like the dispute here in Corinth is not who's head over each other or how should men and women act differently. It's very specific about this head coverings issue. So the supplemental material is where we struggle with, because we say, oh, well, what did he mean by that headship piece? What does he mean by, woman is the glory of man, but man is the glory of God? That was not Paul's main point. So he doesn't explore it more. He uses that as kind of the base. Remember, there's this distinction between man and woman with regard to God, and that leads to a difference in how we're going to approach worship. I think one of the other scriptural supports, I mentioned this on Sunday when we looked at 1 Timothy chapter 2, is there is some distinction where it's headship of man over woman, or this word submit pops up a lot in our English translations about wives submit to your husbands. That's in 1 Peter, but Paul also mentions it. This headship piece comes up in Paul's letter to Ephesians, especially in the New Testament. There is scriptural support for this relationship dynamic of a wife submitting to the husband and the husband loving the wife. We're going to get into all of this on Sunday because it deserves to be sussed out. That's not something that we can say, well, that looks specific to this time period. What does look specific is that issue of head coverings or long hair. We know from the Bible, well, there's not a lot of text about head coverings in worship. I think this is the only one that goes detailed into should we wear them or should we not. In fact, there's other passages like a Nazirite vow in the Old Testament. This is what John the Baptist or Samson had, that they gave them long hair. That was not a disgrace to them. As Paul says, it's a disgrace for a man to wear long hair. So we know that it's not at least timeless in terms of these cultural norms about what's appropriate for length of hair. I think when we read this that those are more culturally bound, whether or not to wear a veil, whether or not to have long hair. And that's what most of us, and that's why in churches there's not these restrictions anymore about women needing to wear the head covering. But there is something there about this distinction between genders, and I think there's a deeper point. That's the last point we talked about with hermeneutics. What is that timeless principle that we can hold on to and then translate into present day? For me, in this passage, if the specifics of covering the head or wearing long hair is cultural, the timeless truth to me is how do we make sure that we're dressing appropriately for worshiping God? Like at the very end, he says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, is it grace to him? He's saying, you know what's appropriate. Take a look and let's be appropriate when we come to worship God. You know, I think all of his discussion about this glory of God, if we follow his argument and say that man's head is Christ, and so it's the image and glory of God, then we glorify God by leaving a male's head uncovered. But if he says a woman is the glory of man, then her head is glorifying man, not God. And when we come to worship, we glorify God. So if there's anything in the way of us glorifying God, we remove it or we cover it. We make sure that when we're gathering to worship, we glorify God. So this is the principle that I would take and apply it forward. I would say, let our approach to worship not distract from God. Yes, that includes apparel. That includes how we dress. We can't dress immodestly, where we're seeking attention. We can't show off. That's scriptural support for that, about not wearing a bunch of jewelry or braiding your hair. We saw that in 1 Timothy chapter 2. But it's also, we can't dress too far down, where we're distracting from worshiping God, where we're teaching ourselves that perhaps we're too casual. We aren't encountering the living God in worship, where others are now distracted. Or when we're talking head coverings, maybe it's not women, but maybe it's men that feel comfortable wearing a hat. Is that going to be distracting for someone else to worship God? We need to be aware of how we look, and not just how we look, but how we act. Are we coming into the sanctuary during worship time, chatting and just kind of viewing this worship or singing songs as something optional, or are we actually communing with our Creator God, our head, the head of the church? Paul says that in Ephesians. I guess we'll get there on Sunday. We'll see if it makes it in the sermon. Or are we just viewing this as something that's casual, that, take it or leave it. It kind of fits me if it fits me. Let our approach to worship not distract from God and God getting glory. To me, that's a timeless principle here. The other timeless principle is the one we're going to explore further on Sunday, and that's the same one that I talked last Sunday. Genders are equal, but can have distinction within the church. So men and women are equal before God. God has created them both in his image.